What if a simple piece of advice from Chopin could help us transform the way that we play the piano? This year we explored some of his advice and wisdom, along with other key lessons that can help with control, expression and technique. Hello and welcome back to Pianistic's End of Year Special. Today we're going to be revisiting some of the key lessons and takeaways from 2024, including how to break free from muscle memory, mastering speed, and of course Chopin's unforgettable advice. These are all about solving real pianistic challenges, so whether you're new here or you've been here since the beginning, there's going to be something for everybody to take into the new year. Let's start with memory. In this video we talked about why we shouldn't rely on muscle memory too much and how it can crack under pressure. Instead, we talked about how we can memorize music before we've even sat at the piano. Can you memorize music without even listening to it? Without even playing it? Today we're jumping into two very important methods of memorization, and I've also got a fun challenge for you as well. Very important method number one for memorizing music is muscle memory. Now, I used to think that muscle memory was memory, and that's all that you needed, until that is one day it went really wrong. In a rather embarrassing experience, all the notes seemed to vanish from my head in a performance, and I forgot what I was playing. That was the moment that I lost confidence in muscle memory, and it was time to start exploring something else. As with all the methods that we'll discuss, muscle memory has its advantages and its disadvantages. And as we're on the subject of it going horribly wrong, here are the other disadvantages. The first of these is that it's really difficult to change or unlearn something that you did from the very beginning. From the moment that you start playing, you're going to start memorizing whatever it is that you're playing. So if you make a mistake, even if it's only once, you will remember that later on. So the really important thing to consider is your ratio, and this is really powerful, your ratio of right to wrong. I remember being taught this as though it was so obvious and that it was almost something I should already know, but it's not. It's simple, but it's not obvious. And this simplicity makes it powerful. So I'll phrase it as a question. Have you ever played something, say, 4 times incorrectly, and then on the 5th attempt you get it right and you move straight on? If you think about it, you've done it 4 times wrong but only once right. So what are the chances that on the next go you get it right? Simply being aware of the ratio changes the way that you're listening to your practice. How many mistakes versus how many times are you getting it right? And this is what is influencing your muscle memory the most. The second thing to bear in mind when it comes to muscle memory is slow practice. Now, we're always told to practice slowly, but why? Well, the reason is that when we go slowly enough, we can think about what's coming up and we're more likely to get it right. Remember, you're going to remember what you play either way, whether you get it right or wrong. If we get it wrong, we're making more work for ourselves in the future because we're going to have to play it more times right. Think about the ratio we talked about earlier versus wrong. We're going to end up playing it more times. Thinking slow, getting it right means we don't have to play it as much. Is muscle memory actually necessary? Well, I'd say yes, especially when it comes to playing fast and intricate passages of music. But what if we could turn this muscle memory into a sort of redundant layer? One that was just a backup for another form of memory. So the next form or layer is all to do with mental practice, and this is where our challenge comes in. So the challenge is this. Take 2 bars or 4 bars, or if you can, a whole piece, and this can be just a simple piece, and to learn it from memory without playing it. There are a lot of reasons for doing this. Not only that, if we think about our forms of memory or our methods, why would we only use one? As I mentioned earlier, I only used one and it went horribly wrong. What if we had a backup? Today we're only talking about 2 forms of memory, but there are more as well. If we can use multiple forms of memory, if one of them decides that it doesn't want to play ball and it decides to jump out of our heads, then we can still rely on the other ones. So the piece that I've chosen as my challenge piece for today is Beethoven's Sonatina in G major, and I'm going to lead you through the steps that I'm going to be thinking about as I try and memorize this so that you can apply it to your own challenge as well. Okay, so looking at the score for the first time is a little bit like sight reading. We're trying to pick up on the patterns underneath the music, and we're going to call this structure, okay? So the first thing that I see is that we have this theme, and this theme comes back a little bit later in the music. In between the two themes, we have a different section. We could call this our development section. So we have theme, development, recap, or the theme comes back, and then right at the end we have a different section with a different melody in it. So this is a little bit like a short coda. So this pattern is going to help us, patterns help us to memorize the music. Now, if we were just learning this from muscle memory, we might not have picked up on the structure of the piece, on the patterns underneath the music, which makes it harder to memorize. The next thing that we want to look at is the key of the music. Now we're in G major, and we're looking at the chords that the piece is based on. I can see that there are basically about 4 different chords in this piece. 2 of them seem to be coming back all of the time, which is a G chord, which is no surprise in G major, and then a D7 chord, the 5th, again, no surprise. And a lot of the piece is actually based on these 2 chords. There's a touch of G7 and C as well, but at the moment those are the only 2 chords that I can see. Chords are a little bit like words in a sentence. If you can read words, this is much better than reading individual notes, and individual notes would be like reading letters in the sentence. This is perhaps one of the biggest advantages to doing this kind of mental practice. You are seeing the music in a different way. You can memorize these patterns of chords. Again, it's all to do with patterns. If you can memorize patterns, you can play it. Muscle memory, risky business. I'd like to emphasize as well that this theory is not complicated. This is quite basic theory. It's just about understanding the basic chords, the keys that your pieces are based on, and even if you're playing more complicated pieces, then using these simpler pieces as memory exercises is a really good idea. You can work through that theory in those as well. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at is the melody, and this is where perhaps the most experience is going to come in, but there's a little bit of a workaround here. So we're going to be trying to pitch the melody and think about basically how it sounds, the rhythm and the pitch of the melody, so that we can remember it. Now, if your pitch isn't quite there yet to be able to pitch all the different intervals and hear it in your head, and it's taken a very long time for me to get to this point, and it's certainly not perfect. I'm going to be using the next step to help me out with this actually. But if you're not quite there yet with your sense of pitch, then why not listen to it along with your mental practice? So the next step is going to be thinking about the sort of visual memory. And the visual memory is all to do with how does the score actually look? How do the notes look on the page? And trying to remember this in those certain points where you're not sure as much as possible. So for instance, whenever we've got a jump and the interval's going to be slightly harder to pitch, remembering the particular note that you're jumping to can be a massive help here. The other part to the visual memory that I almost forgot to say was how do the chords look on the page? Every chord has a shape to it, and shapes are a lot easier to remember again than individual notes. Again, we can miss all of these things when we learn a piece from muscle memory, and even if you don't want to, or you just think it's a waste of time to try and learn a whole piece from memory, I mean, it is a challenge, and it is good fun, and it is good for your memory. But even if you think it's a waste of time, going through these steps of mental practice, even if you're not going to spend the time afterwards learning the whole piece from memory, is hugely beneficial. It basically means that you're not just relying on the muscle memory. Before we jump into step number 6, if you're not sure what to practice when you sit at the piano, then use a routine like the 60-minute routine that's available from the link in the description below. It's complete with loads of book recommendations, and you'll know exactly what to practice when you sit at the piano. So the next step is to actually practice the piece. Now, of course, we're not going to be playing it, but if you did play it, you might work on it in sections. So you might work on the theme first, and then the development, and so on. And this is exactly what I'm going to do in the mental practice as well. We're going to take the blocks, all the sections, and we're going to work on them one by one. As we do the block practice and the mental practice of each of the sections, we're also going to be looking out for any patterns that we can spot. So these are patterns in the chord sequence in the left hand, for instance. It just moves stepwise quite a bit. This is an easy pattern to spot, and then that pattern is easier again to memorize. Other patterns are to do with the structure. The structure is a pattern in itself. Another pattern that I just spotted are the descending scales. So it just steps down one each time, and it's just a scale that moves down about 7 notes. All of these things help us build this mental picture that's going to help us memorize the music. Okay, so I'm going to take some time. I'm going to do some practice of this. I don't know how long this is going to take. I'm probably not going to say how long this is going to take, because honestly, it doesn't matter. Just take as long as you need to. And if you need a couple of days to do it, then take a couple of days. But you'll kind of know when you're ready to play it. And we don't know how it's going to go, but we'll see. All right, let's have a look. Okay, so it wasn't perfect, and I wanted it to be. I wanted to re-record it so that it was perfect and it was really good, but it wasn't, and it doesn't have to be. The point here is not to create something that's perfect, it's to do that mental practice, and hopefully this will give you a different approach to practicing that perhaps you haven't done before. Make it at your level. It might be a harder piece than that, it might be a simpler 4-bar piece, for instance. Choose a piece that's at your level. And there are a couple of things actually that I went through when I was going through it in the practice that I didn't mention before. And the first of these is to do it hand separately. Run the whole piece through in your head hand separately, just like you would actually if you were practicing. The second one is really just to try and make all the mistakes in your head first, and to try and recall the music as you're going. So I spent a lot of time looking away from the music with my eyes shut, just trying to remember what the music was. And when I couldn't remember it, I just looked at it, remembered it, and then I tried to remember that for the next time. When we're memorizing, it's easy to forget what's happening in our left hand. We put all of our focus onto the right hand and onto the important melody, and we forget what's happening in the left. So in the next video, we try to adjust our attention and put it back onto the left hand. If you give this challenge a go, do let me know how you got on in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. With this solid foundation, the next step is to tackle physical challenges at the piano, particularly how to do jumps at the piano. Here's what we uncovered. The technique we're going to learn today isn't just about being fast and accurate with jumps on the piano, but it's about being accurate with everything that we play. There are 3 primary challenges that we face when it comes to jumps, and 3 solutions to those challenges that we'll go through. We'll then cover the primary technique that I think I've used for about 20 years in every single practice session that helps with jumps on the piano. One of the tricky parts to playing the piano is the fact that we're always moving around. Our position isn't set in one place. We're always moving and we're always jumping. So it seems like a sensible thing to want to improve. There are, however, 3 challenges that I see get in the way of this, and the first one is best explained with an example. So I'm going to play this short section of a waltz twice, the first time with the mistake in and the second without, and I want you to see if you can spot what the difference is. And version 2. So if you're thinking that the difference was the speed, then you would be right, but that's only as a symptom of the mistake that I was making. So the real difference is that I didn't want to move my left hand before I had finished playing the melody notes in my right hand. This is natural because we only want to do one thing at once. We move our left hand, and then we move our right hand, and then we move our left hand, and so on. The problem with this is that you're never prepared for what's actually coming up, so you end up with a version that's slower, more hesitant, and slightly stammered. So the solution to this is primarily in two parts, and it's mainly a hand independence issue. What we want to do is move our left hand while our right hand is also simultaneously playing the melody. So our right hand has got this melody in the first two bars, and our left hand has got these moves. So what we want to do is, if we did it super slowly, we've got to move the left hand while the right hand is playing, moving. Very natural to want to just stop, wait for the right hand to finish, carry on, stop, wait for the right hand to finish. But as we said, that stops the music. So moving while we're playing. There can be some sort of unwillingness from our brain to let us do this. We really do like to do only one thing at once. As soon as you tell it to do two things at once, move while also playing, you get some resistance there. Playing it hand separately, practicing it hand separately really helps to know what you're aiming for. If you know what you're aiming for in each hand, then when it comes together, try to replicate that. Going slowly as well really helps. If I tried to do that really fast, it just wouldn't work. But if I can do this melody in my right hand and tell my left hand to move very slowly while you're playing it, it starts to fit together and it starts to flow, it starts to move on. So the second part to the solution is to think about what's coming up. It's to look ahead so that you're preparing. If you're stuck on the note that you're thinking about, then it's going to sound stuck. It's going to be stopped. If you want it to sound like it's flowing on, and we do, then thinking about the next note all of the time is what you need to be doing. The next challenge is all to do with accuracy of jumps on the piano. How can we get them so accurate that we're getting them right all of the time? Again, this is a two-part solution, and the first part is all to do with the technique that we're going to jump into in just a moment. And the second part is something that I like to think about, which is to do with measuring the distance between one note and the other and feeling the movement over the jump. Playing the piano is all about measuring distances between notes and building out that vocabulary. But if you want to remember the distances that you measure, try this. To measure the distance, we'll take the jumps in the beginning of the Gershwin, and what we want to do is just move smoothly and slowly between the notes of the jump. Once you've felt it a few times, see if you can do it without looking, just finding the notes. It's about mapping and building that picture in your head so that you no longer need to look at it. Also, avoid a kind of fast and loose motion, as you might get it a few times, but it's not going to stick around. It won't be accurate in the long run. That's why slow practice, we always come back to slow practice. There's so many reasons for it, but that's one of the reasons why we do the slow practice as well. As you become more and more comfortable with it with your eyes shut, you can gradually start to increase the speed. So we've learned how to measure the distance and covered an exercise for practicing this, but how can we make sure that we're accurate and consistently accurate? Well, this is where how you practice comes in. If you want to be accurate, you need to complete the movement or the action more times right than you did wrong. And we won't dive into this too much, as we have done a sort of deep dive on it recently. But essentially, you want to complete the movement more times right than you have done wrong. Essentially, just think about completing the movement a certain number of times right in a row. So I like to do about 6 times, but you might want to start with about 4 times correct in a row. Now, if you get it wrong on the 4th attempt, you actually have to go back to number 1 and then repeat the process up to 4. But what you want to avoid here is mindless repetition. It's easy just to get into the swing of just not really thinking about it. But if you make a mistake, ask yourself what went wrong. Why did it go wrong? That way you're much more likely to get it right the next time. Before we jump into today's technique, if you want more tutorials on things like jumps, more techniques, memorization, and music generally, hit the subscribe button below and the notification bell so that you can be updated with all of the latest tutorials. So the technique that we're going to use today sort of ties in all of the essential exercises, challenges, and solutions that we've talked about into one neat technique, but with a slight twist. So we'll take the jumps in the beginning of the Gershwin again, and this technique is all about actually being over the notes that you're jumping to before you play them. It's almost like a cheat. That is the twist. You don't actually have to jump straight to them. You're going to jump to being over them before you play them. That's going to help you massively with accuracy, because think about it, you're going to be over the notes before you play them, and that's what we're going to call this technique, over before you play. So to give you an example, we're going to jump and spring off the notes, pretty quickly moving to where we need to be, but instead of playing immediately, we're just going to pause over the notes for a couple of seconds and then play them. So it's this movement of springing off, and then being accurately over the notes that you're going to play. Measuring the distance is what you did earlier. It looks like when you're doing it fast that you're actually jumping straight to the notes, and sometimes you do need to do that. But if you practice the over before you play, then you'll be able to see that I'm actually over the notes well before I need to play them. So we can think of it in three clear steps. The first part is to rebound off, move over the notes that you're going to play, but not playing them. And it might take a little bit of practice to move quickly off and measure where you're going. Also, bear in mind that you don't want to go too high. Moving your hand high up in the air is kind of wasted movement. We don't need to go that way. We just need to go horizontally that way. So the arc that we were talking about earlier actually needs to be a very shallow arc. It doesn't want to be like a massive rainbow. The next step is to do it without putting the delay or the pause in there too much. You're still going to be over the notes marginally before you play them, but not purposefully leaving a couple of seconds. And bear in mind that you want to be looking at where you're going, not what you're playing right now. So for instance, as I'm playing this one, I'm actually looking up here. And as I'm playing this one, I'm looking down. So you're never looking at, you're actually looking at the opposite of where you're playing. I'm looking down, I'm looking up. And the third step is to incorporate this back into the piece that you're playing. Sometimes when learning music, we spend more time on the technique and learning the notes than actually on the music itself. So if you want to know how to memorize music before you've even sat at the piano, check out the next video. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you there. Precision alone isn't always enough. Pianists often feel stuck when it comes to speed. In this next one, we talk about how we can develop more speed and make our playing more controlled and effortless. Until you know how, playing fast on the piano can seem like a really daunting challenge. Just looking at a page full of black ink is enough to put you off. I, for one, really didn't used to like playing pieces that had lots of fast passages in, but now I enjoy practicing them and I enjoy playing them. And so I thought today we could go through everything that you need to get playing fast on the piano. We can break this really into three main sections. The first one's about movement. This is your foundation of how you play at the piano. The second one's about your practice strategy, knowing what you're going to practice when you sit at the piano. And the third one's really about your mental strategy. How are you going to approach playing something that is quite tricky? And lastly, we're going to go through the secret sauce, which is going to tie everything together and is really going to help with your fast playing. Instead of technique, I've called it movement. And that's because it's the refining of the movement of your hands, your arms, your fingers that's going to allow you to play faster. If there's a particular piece that you're playing at the moment, think about how these four movements can be applied to it. It took me years to figure this one out, and it's often hiding there right in front of you. But it's how independent your fingers are from each other. So I thought we could do a quick challenge and an exercise to see how independent our fingers are and how we can improve our finger independence. So playing fast passages, scales, and even voicing chords, these are all much easier once your fingers are independent. So here's a simple exercise for you to try out to make your fingers a little bit more independent from each other. All right, so when we're doing this exercise, all we need to do is put our hands on the keys, making sure that our wrist is relaxed, and we're kind of lightly on top of the keys here. And all we need to do is play the thumb and then cycle through the other fingers. And then we're going to repeat that, but this time we're going to hold the second finger down. Make sure that your fingers lift after each time that you press the note. Now we'll repeat this, but on the third finger. This one's a little bit more challenging. And then repeat that for the other two as well. So that's kind of how that exercise goes. And that will really help for your fingers to become more independent from each other. The next big movement, or it's kind of actually a little movement, that you really need to consider when you're playing is how your fingers are moving. And that is, they're going down, but are they coming up again? So what we often see is that our fingers will go down, but they're not retracting quick enough to then play the next note. And this is a big problem when it comes to faster playing. But there's a really simple solution. And for me, I find that practicing staccato playing, that pressing down and then lifting up of the finger, really helps to get you playing faster. Now, you're not going to play your passage fast, but practicing staccato really helps. Now, if you want to take this one step further, you can think about how you can practice staccato with different finger movements as well. So say you wanted to play a five-note little scale like that. There are different ways that you can move your fingers. So you could flick them back, or you could flick them forwards, or you can think about them going vertically downwards. Again, it's retracting your finger after you've played it as well. Ideally, stay as close to the key as you can, and that will help you to build your speed as you're playing. So your fingers are now more independent. They're now moving in a different way. You can apply this to all of your scales, all of your arpeggios. Again, these can be practiced staccato, and that will really help to build in these patterns that you're learning in your scales and arpeggios, but also using finger movements while you're doing it. One of the big problems with trying to play fast on the piano is that it's really easy to tense up. The harder and harder you try, the slower and slower you go. So it's really important to get used to practicing relaxation in your muscles when you're playing. One of the biggest places that I see tension coming about is in your wrist. And I want to go through this exercise that allows you to let go of your wrist, use it in a slightly different way perhaps, and that will help you to get it on the move and get it relaxed and playing a little bit faster. So a great exercise for getting your wrist to become a little bit more flexible, a little bit more relaxed, is the first Hanon exercise. And what we're going to think about is, as we move through the exercise, we're going to go down and through a shallow bowl. And then as we continue with the exercise, we're going to use another bowl on top of that bowl. I know I'm talking about bowls, this is kind of crazy, but we're going to think about another bowl on top of that bowl, and we're going to go over the top of it. Let me show you what I mean. So as you go down and through, your wrist goes down in this bowl shape, and then we're going to go over the top as we continue. So down and through, over the top, down and through, over the top. As you continue with this exercise, you don't need to move your wrist as much. You get used to moving it up and down and around, but as you continue doing it, try to minimize your movements. Try to make the same movement but smaller as you go. So for instance, we're trying to make the same movement but smaller. Now that your technique's in place, how do you actually approach the piece that you're playing? Well, that's where your practice strategy comes in. But before we jump into that, if you feel as though your practice isn't as well rounded as it could be, that is, you're not focusing on everything that you should be in a practice session, then the practice routine that I've been using for years can help you to know exactly what to do when you sit down at the piano. It's complete with loads of book recommendations, and you can get it from the link in the description below. So this is a 4-part practice strategy so that you know exactly what to do when you start your practice. And make sure that before you jump into these that you know your piece hand separately, you know your notes, and you know your rhythms. So part 1's simple, and it's easy as well. It's about practicing slowly, but more importantly than slowly, it's about practicing smoothly. And what I mean by this is connecting all of your notes up in legato, measuring the distance between every note that you're playing. This will lay the foundation for when it comes to playing faster. Part 2 is really going to help you with your slow practice, and it's to use the most important tool that you have available to you, and that is the metronome. So when you've got a piece of music, you have a target speed. For instance, at the moment I'm learning a piece which my target speed is 160 BPM. So what I always suggest doing is taking your target speed, 160, divide it by 2, which gives you 80. And then sometimes actually I even start at about 60, a little bit slower than this, but this will be your starting point. Now that you've got your starting point, just add 5 or 10 BPM as you go until you hit a point where it gets really hard. At that point, you can practice just below that and see if you can just push that line a little bit further. Once you've found the line, you'll start to get more comfortable at that speed, especially if you've practiced in small increments going up from your half speed. And then you'll be able to start pushing that line slowly over time. Part 3 is about finding other and interesting ways to practice. And one of the ways that I like to do this is to use rhythms. For instance, if you're playing in semiquavers, as I am in my piece, you can use different combinations of semiquavers and quavers, or 16th notes and 8th notes, if those are the terms that you use. So for instance, you can use 2 semiquavers, a quaver and a quaver, or you could swap that round. You could use 2 quavers and then 2 semiquavers. Or you could put the semiquavers in the middle. So we'll have a quaver, 2 semiquavers, and a quaver. You can also do this with your metronome practice, so you can combine it with that to practice those at different speeds. That allows you to cover all of the connections at different speeds as well. There are so many different combinations of rhythms that you can use. You can use triplet rhythms as well, for instance. But just make sure that when you're doing this, you're going over that particular movement that you find hard. Part 4 is about asking yourself, how else can I practice this? For instance, could you use block chords in your practice? Could you combine it with what you did with your staccato practice earlier? There are so many different options, and in fact, you should combine all of these. So we've covered some really important points about technique and practice strategy, but we really need to talk about how we frame fast music, and that's where your mental strategy comes in. Before we jump into the big takeaway that is the secret sauce, consider these 4 points that are really easy to forget. So the first is problem solving, and for this you really need to stop playing. Let me explain. So have you ever found yourself repeating the same thing over and over again, but without achieving the outcome that you want? I certainly have. Well, for this, what you really need to do is stop playing and start problem solving. It's to ask yourselves questions like, why can't I play this? What movement would my hand, arm, or fingers need to make to be able to play this? What exercise could I practice today so that I can play this tomorrow or next week or next month? So you've identified the passage you're struggling with, you've asked yourself the problem-solving questions, and you've even worked on the technique. Well, now what? Well, I'd really encourage you to write it down on the score. I can't believe I actually did this recently, but I went through this whole process of problem-solving, working out the technique, practicing it, and then I went to write it down on my score only to find that I'd already written it before. That's a mistake that I'm really hopefully only going to make once. The second part of the mental strategy is just to use time. Time to allow you to problem solve, to memorize, to work out and really get to know the piece that you're playing. Sometimes working harder just doesn't work, and what we need to do is actually wait for things to just click. This can be frustrating because it's unpredictable, but time really helps. So allow time in your practice and be patient with your playing. So the next one's all about practice, and I don't just mean practice generally, but I mean practicing fast pieces. The more that you practice fast pieces, the more that you'll develop strategies, techniques that you'll be able to transfer to the other fast pieces that you're playing. So the secret sauce is about combining your mental strategy, your movement, everything that we've talked about today, but it's also to do with changing your perspective. So when it comes to playing fast, oftentimes what we try and do is just play individual notes, but quite fast. Instead, try to group your notes together in movements as much as possible. So for instance, if we take just a 5-note scale, instead of playing them individually with your arm, try to create a movement that goes through and plays multiple notes in one movement. No matter what you're playing, if it's your hand and exercise, just try and combine all of your notes into one movement. Whatever it is, try and create one movement out of it. That's now one movement. So creating one movement can help you to develop that speed throughout the passage that you're playing. It's really about thinking about this as fewer units. Instead of many things, we've now only got one thing. And one thing per bar, one thing per phrase, per passage. That will get things moving along much quicker. Something that we haven't touched on in this really technical tutorial is musical expression and shaping. So to balance out your technique with your musicality, be sure to check out this next video. And if you found this valuable, don't forget to subscribe. I'll catch you in the next one. Finally, we turn to the heart of music, expression, and who better to guide us other than Chopin? Let's revisit his advice. This isn't a hack or a quick trick that Chopin suggested. It goes to the very heart of what it is to create music at the piano. It'll help you to learn faster, to create a more beautiful sound, to improve your memory recall, and to play with greater expression, and yet it has everything and nothing to do with actually playing the piano itself. We'll explore exactly what Chopin recommended, why it matters, and how you can put this directly into your playing. Then I'll share some simple exercises on how you can sharpen this skill. But before we dive in, here's a quick Chopin trivia question for you. What was the object that never left Chopin's piano? The piano can create a huge range of sounds, but at its core, it's still a mechanical and percussive instrument. And as pianists, that's something we want to stay aware of. It's easy to make your sound almost robotic or mechanical when you're playing. And that's why I believe Chopin was so adamant that his students would attend singing lessons and would listen to Italian song and opera. If this is something that you haven't explored before, then this is going to be another string to your bow. So yes, the piano is a mechanical instrument, but why does that matter? Singing lays the foundation for so much of music, how we get louder and softer, how we breathe in the music, how we articulate it, and how we connect with it on a deeper level. None of that is necessary immediately to be able to play the piano. And that's where I think as pianists we get caught up. We get caught up in the technicalities of playing, and we sometimes forget about the musicality of it. But with singing, you're naturally drawn to focus on the musical line and the flow of the music. Now we just need to put that into our playing. Let's explore the 4 ways that singing can enhance the sound of your playing. And the first one is all to do with this shift in focus. The shift in focus from the technicalities of playing to listening to the musical line, the melody of what you are playing. This change in focus can transform how you listen to what you're playing. For instance, for pieces which have multiple moving lines or voices that weave between the hands, it's easy to lose track of what the main voice or the melody is. By singing the melody, you have a clearer picture of what needs to be voiced and produced projected and the secondary voices that need to be played a little bit softer. A great example of this would be in a piece I was just looking at the other day, and I was thinking about this exact thing. It was about keeping the melody line loud in the right hand while also managing the other little notes that we need to play. So here's a version where we can hear the melody line clearly above after having thought about singing it. Without thinking about that main melody line, it would be easier for those other notes in the right hand to disrupt that line. So that would happen if we played all of the notes almost equally. By singing the main line, you can gain the clarity, gain the understanding of what needs to be projected, what needs to be voiced, and then try to replicate that in your playing. The second way that singing can help is with timing. While it's easy to rush when you're playing with just your fingers, it's much harder to rush when you're singing. So one method would be to sing through the musical line first and then listen to that and try and replicate it on the piano. Another method would be just to sing through as you're playing, and you may find that this, because you're not rushing now, allows you more space and time to listen to what you're playing and to listen to the timing. The next benefit is in how you shape a phrase, not just in terms of volume, but also in terms of timing. When you sing, you naturally start soft to create a louder sound, a crescendo towards the middle, and then a diminuendo getting softer towards the end. And this is exactly what you want to do in your playing as well. In terms of your timing, you want to give a push towards the center and then a slight pullback towards the end. So what makes the benefits of singing universal and predictable? Well, I think it comes down to breathing. When we form a sentence, we have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we breathe before we create that sentence, much like a musical phrase. So singing helps to create these natural pauses or breaks in the music that feel almost instinctive and natural, because they come from how we breathe. On the piano though, there are no physical restrictions on when you can breathe, so you could end up creating phrases that sound almost unnatural or unmusical. If we think about this in terms of our Mendelssohn, we can think about when we would naturally breathe, and I suspect it would be after the first 5 bars. So we have the intro, which is like a piano accompaniment. We breathe, and then we play. For the next phrase, and we've actually got a rest in there to do that. And so on. So think about how long your phrases are and where you would put those breath marks in. We need to sustain the musical line, keep it moving until that breath. If we lose momentum in the middle of that phrase, that would be unnatural, because that's not what we do when we were singing. We would need to keep it going, waiting for that breath that's coming. So we've covered the musical role of singing in terms of how to create a shape in your playing and creating a more musical line. But how can it help with memory recall and playing by ear? Singing exercises help you to develop your sense of pitch and internalize different intervals. This is what allows you to play more by ear. Listening to music and then replicating that out loud is what helps with memory recall. Here are 4 exercises that are essential to help you to do this. So you can start with singing scales, simple scales, and you can use your hand to help you to visualize the changes in step in the sound. So for instance, you can take a C, and then stepping up, D, E, F, G, and so on. Practice starting on different notes and use the piano to help you to begin with. Next, get rid of the piano, but give yourself the starting note and do the same scale. Listen to it back and see how accurate you were. You'll quickly realize what your vocal range is, and you'll learn to hear those different steps in pitch. Approach arpeggios in a similar way, but instead of steps with our hand, we're going to visualize a skip, skipping over one of those steps. So this is going to help you to learn and recognize the intervals of a third and a fifth. So arpeggio of G. So we've got our G, our B, and then our D, which is our fifth. Next up, learn each of the intervals in the octave. Now we've already learned the third and fifth, and this can help you to find some of the others. But one of the great methods for learning this is actually to use a different song to help you to pitch an interval. So for instance, an octave, you can use the melody of Over the Rainbow. Once you're comfortable with the scales, arpeggios, and intervals, it's time to try out your knowledge with some sight singing. Sight singing is reading music at sight, a melody that you haven't seen before, and singing it out loud. To start with, just pick melodies that move stepwise in small steps like your scales, and then you can progress to intervals later. You can use dedicated books for this, but I find that early beginner piano music is perfect because it often begins with stepwise motion and then you gradually progress to intervals. You can begin by using the piano to help you along with this, and then try and do it without the piano, and then use the piano to check afterwards. When you're confident, you can progress to listening to a melody and then trying to replicate that, first by singing it and then by playing it on the piano. Something that's crucial for both piano playing and singing is maintaining the correct posture to support your technique. In the next video, we go over the fundamental setup and how to sit at the piano. As for the one object that Chopin always kept at his piano, you may or may not be surprised to learn that it was the metronome. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. As we head into 2025, I want to thank you for watching, and I wish you the best with your piano journey going forwards. But if you're new here, hit the subscribe button, and if you're not, hit the notification bell so that you can be updated about all of the latest lessons in the new year. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.